ago also. But anyway, the 60s, what you want to talk about, started out as a very quiet, affluent, everything going good time. And by the mid to late 60s, this country was in turmoil. It was from the Vietnam War, the protest, early 60s, it wasn't, later 60s, mid 60s, it all started. I graduated in 64, and that's when they were drafting, that's when you had the draft. In fact, I still have my, you ever heard of the draft card, the 1A? I'm still 1A, which means if they were doing the draft today, other than I'm too old, they could take me. And that's what 1A meant. I never got a deferment in school. You could get a college deferment when you were going to school, but as soon as you get out of school, you were in the military immediately. And I didn't do that, so they could have, as long as I kept my grades up, they weren't going to draft you. Then when I graduated from school, I finished my classes in January of 64, then went across the stage in May of 64. And my daughter was born in June of 64. So it kind of all happened. And at that time, the Vietnam War was just really starting to ratchet up. And if you were married, you didn't have to go. And then it got, in about that time, they said if you were married and no children, then you were going to be drafted. If as long as you were 1A or whatever. And then I had a child, so then I missed that. Fortunate, I ended up missing it the whole time because I was planning on going into the military immediately after graduation because I knew that's where I was going to have to go anyway, and that was fine with me. But I thought rather than getting drafted into the Army or something I didn't want to go, I was going to pick my military service. But as it turned out, I didn't have to do that. A lot of my friends did, and a lot of my friends are still there, dead, basically what it is. So anyway, that time, campus looks completely different. We found an old picture. This is the campus. I'll pass it around. You can't really see it, but this is the campus. And it's pretty close to, in fact, it's the way I remember it, but this building right here is where I probably had 90% of my classes. It's Quonset. We call it the old Quonset huts. And you know what a Quonset hut is? You ever heard of that? It's a military term. It's in World War II, they had these long, and you'll see the building, it's almost a block long, rectangular buildings, and that was the bunkhouses for the military. That's where the soldiers lived. And so after the war, they moved this is World War II, they moved these facilities around to schools, and that's what they used for classrooms, and that was the business school. So I probably had 90% of my classes in the business school. The only other buildings that are around, there's the administration building. There's the Gold Star. That's Frederickson Fieldhouse. You ever heard of Frederickson Fieldhouse? That's where the basketball and gymnasium used to be, and it was underground. So what you see is just the roof because the basketball was actually about two stories down. And then I think, if I remember right, I can't remember for sure, but it's either this building, I think it's this building, is the student union, somewhat in the same location where it was. But anyway, I'll pass it around. You guys can look at that, and it gives you kind of some idea of what the campus looked like back in those times. So there really wasn't much of the campus, and about the only class I had classes at the administration building. Not very many, but I had quite a few at the Gold Star. But the majority of my classes were all in what I call the Quonset huts, or the business school. And I took my last 3 semesters here, I took 18 hours. I first started out at OU and decided that I was a better party guy than I was a student, and they didn't much like me, I didn't much like them. So I lasted 1 year down there, and then came back here and was married. Got married that summer, which is unusual in today's times. Kids don't do that. Back then, people got married out of high school, early in college. That was just just the way it happened. I've got grandkids that are a lot older than you guys. So, I mean, that just tells you how young we all started back in those days. But anyway, so I came here and decided, well, if I'm either going to have to get a job and go to work, or I'm going to have to go to school and study. And so I came to OCU, liked it much better. My classes at OU, I remember I had a government class that must have had at least 400 students in it. And I didn't have the background of being able to, the good study habits out of the high school that I came from, that I couldn't handle that. I mean, I just figured it was a big party down there. Well, you come to OCU and you have classes like this size, and you could know your professors, and they kind of took me under the wing, and I ended up being a pretty good student. I wasn't a great student, but it's okay. And anyway, my last 3 semesters I took 18 hours, but when I went to school here, I'd go start class every morning at 7:30, and I never had a class in 3.5 years that was ever got out later than 12:30 in the afternoon, which was a real benefit being out of the business school, because I also held 2 jobs at the same time. I held a job when I got out of school from like 1 o'clock in the afternoon till 5, and then I had a job on the weekends at what was called Highlander Bowling Palace. It was bowling and that sort of thing, and I was the manager on the weekends from, if I remember right, 7 in the morning, Saturday and Sunday, to 2 or 3 in the afternoon. So that was my job. And then after classes, after I worked 5 o'clock, I'd just go home and study. I mean, they're just, when you have a wife and a small child and no money, that's what you did. You studied, and that's just all you did. But anyway, so I could take all of those hours, 18 hours, and never go up, never be out any later than 12:30. It'd be Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, you'd take the hour classes, and Tuesday, Thursday, you'd have the hour and a half classes, which I thought was great, because I liked the idea of working. Wanted the money. I was fortunate my parents could pay for my education. That was good. But I didn't ask them for any living expenses or anything like that, and just took care of myself from then on. So I did a little research, then I'll let you get your questions. Just some curiosity thing. Things I take for granted, things that you may not. But pocket calculator wasn't invented till '71. The floppy disk, what a floppy disk is. Those are now extinct. They weren't invented till '71. First video game in '72. First CD in '72. These were all invented, but I never even heard of those things until probably the 80s or 90s, whenever they really got popular. First personal computer in '73, no clue, that a long time ago. Microsoft wasn't even started until '75. Apple wasn't started until 1976. The modem, which is what transmits data from phone lines, wasn't even invented until '77. Internet, 1990. eBay, 95, Google, 98, and Xbox, 2001. So, I mean, you just look at the we had no technology when we were going to school. I remember my senior thesis had to be, I was in the management school, had to be 50 pages, single-spaced, and it had to be typed, and you could not have one whiteout on the page. And we didn't have computers that typed them. There was the old-fashioned typewriters, and there were students here, female students, that would type them for you for, I can't remember what we paid, 25 or 50 cents a page, whatever it was. And they could get to the bottom of a page and hit a wrong key on typewriter, and you got to start over again. And they did this all the time, the reports. So where today we've got spell check and all the stuff that we all use. Back then we had zip when it came to that sort of stuff. I went through and pulled out some facts about what was going on. This is in 1960, which would have been probably my freshman year here. Dwight Eisenhower was the president. You probably heard of him. John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon, you know who those two are, had their first that was the first presidential debate ever heard on TV, 1970. The Soviet Union shoots down the U-2 spy plane by Francis Gary Powers. You ever heard of that? You know what I'm talking about? That's when that happened. I remember all these too. I mean, it's amazing. I may not be able to tell you what I did last month, but I remember stuff 30 and 40 years ago. It doesn't make, you'll figure that out as you get older. You can remember stuff so far back that's just, it's crazy. Fidel Castro nationalized all American assets in Cuba, took them. I was fortunate, I wish I'd taken better advantage of it, but when I was in high school here, went to Northwest Classen, Fidel Castro took over, I think it was in late 50s, and basically took people's assets. There was a family that moved, that my folks brought in from Cuba that sponsored, that had lost everything. He was a big car dealer in Havana, and brought over, and the son lived with me, lived with us in the house. This family is still here in town, but it just, I mean, back in that generation, we lived that, what was going on with Castro and Cuba and all that sort of stuff. Then